Welcome to the Briefing Room. The Briefing Room is a flagship interview series by Global Policy Commons where we bring together scholars, experts, leaders, and practitioners from around the world to explore how ideas turn to action and how policy can become more inclusive, participatory, and transformative. Our first guest is Professor Duncan Green, who is an LSE Professor in Practice and Senior Strategic Advisor at Oxfam. He previously served as Oxfam's Head of Research, a Visiting Fellow at Notre Dame University, and the Senior Policy Advisor on Trade and Development at the Department for International Development. He has worked extensively on active citizenship and change, and has authored several books, including How Change Happens. Without further ado, here's Professor Duncan Green on active citizenship, ethical activism, and the evolving relationship between local action and global policy change.
So yeah, how do you get a stronger and active citizenship?
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Nina. It's great to be here. All these questions are kind of, you can have the 30-second answer or the 30-hour answer. But I suppose a quick point on active citizenship, and I guess this interview is geared towards people who want to be active citizens or work with active citizens. Couple of things. One is understand the people you want to dance with. So there's a great writer about systems thinking called Donella Meadows who says, if you want to change a system, you have to learn to dance with it, which is understand how it moves, how it changes over time, and then you adjust your tactics or your engagement with the system accordingly. So activists can't be rigid. They can't have a set plan. They have to have relationships and antennae and spot when a window of opportunity opens up and move to it quickly. So it's being agile and fast. And to do that, you have to have a really good bunch of relationships. You have to step outside your own preoccupations, your anger, your outrage, your passion, and see things through the eyes of people who may not share those passions, and see what motivates them, and then find a bridge and go across the bridge. So it's quite a mindset question, I think. There's some tools we teach at the LSE to help you with that mindset question, but it's above all, it's about how you carry yourself and your confidence in stepping outside your own state of mind and seeing things through the eyes of others. We call it POVO, the point of view of the other. Really important acronym.
That's really interesting because I often think of activists as actually some of the most strong-minded, sort of willful, maybe even least interested in stepping outside of their own perspective on a lot of issues. And so I wonder if you have any opinions about balancing that commitment to the cause and actually getting things done in a more pragmatic way by obviously speaking, with other
Yeah, I
people.
mean, it's something that I wrestled with writing the book How Change Happens, and then with the training, is that I think if you're going to be a good activist, you have to be comfortable with a whole set of dissonances, of cognitive dissonances. You have to be in your own head with all the passion and rage and that drives you, and in the head of someone who might be a bit 9 to 5, might be a bit meh, I could do this, but why should I, kind of thing. So you have to be able to span that. You have to be able to span that politically. And so I think the way to do that is to be confident in yourself, to not think that a bunch of fairly tired recipes about activism work. I think speaking truth to power is a terrible theory of change. Most of the time, power doesn't listen. Every now and then, you get something amazing happens, like in Bangladesh last year. But generally, speaking truth to power is more about therapy than change. So you've got to actually be, I don't think pragmatic, maybe Machiavellian, maybe just smart. It's about emotional intelligence for me.
Hmm. Hmm. That's really interesting. We had another question on social inclusion, and how that intersects with, I mean, obviously activist work, but also just policy reform in general, and to what extent you can be aiming for social inclusion all the time, or whether you have to be aiming for very specific types of reform that may not be the most inclusive or, sort of target everyone at once. Um,
Yeah, really. I guess this is another of those trade-offs, distances things. So one sort of maxim is nothing about us without us. That if you are talking about minoritized groups, then they should be at the table, right? And that's like a moral position for a number of organizations, and it's a very laudable one. On the other hand, there's a whole area of influencing which talks about going with the grain, understanding how power works, and nudging it in directions to come to a more progressive position, which may be exclusive. So as a white man professor, I can go and have a meeting with someone and maybe suggest a few things. If I say I'm only coming if I can bring 40 of my colleagues representing all groups which are affected by this conversation, then the problem is the person is either going to say no, or they're just going to treat it in a totally different way, much more of a formal thing. So you have to, I think, I guess you should be inclusive unless you have a good reason not to,
mm,
rather than not be inclusive unless you have a good reason to be inclusive. It's like your default should be inclusion. And a lot of that goes with leadership development. So you should not be kind of hugging all the skills and the knowledge and the contacts and so on to yourself. You should be consciously developing leaders from the minoritized groups, so that you can just step back, right? I mean, and that's I think something good activism does. I'm giving a lecture on community organizing this week in my course at the LSE, and that puts a huge emphasis on leadership development more than almost anything else. You have to have, in some community organizations, you're supposed to have a quota. You have 25 one-to-ones a month where you sit down with people who might be leaders and you try and work out what they're angry about, what moves them, and then you push them to become leaders. It's quite brutal in some cases. And out of that emerges generation after generation of grassroots leaders. So it's that conscious development of leadership rather than just saying, well, we're going to go for the win. And if someone learns a few things and it gets into leadership, well, great. So it's a really different way of approaching it to traditional advocacy, which is all about the win. This is all about the leadership.
that's very interesting because I feel like some of that you're saying brutal as like pushing people towards that goal. And that brings me to a different question, which was to what extent can some of these things be taught in activist circles, and to what extent does it just have to be there at the grassroots level? And maybe building off of that, in communities like or places like Bangladesh, is there a role for organizations outside of Bangladesh to be coming in and speaking about all these policy related things in the hopes of boosting local capacity, or is that kind of just going to be a failing effort because there isn't sort of more the grassroots understanding, perhaps?
Well, you just hit my white savior button because although I have been to Bangladesh, I'm not going to talk about Bangladesh.
Yes, sure,
Let's
of
listen to a
course, of
podcast which
course.
is aimed at Bangladeshis, all right? So I guess, again, a trade off, right? So the times are very decolonial, and it's very tempting to just say, we know nothing, all wisdom is local.
Mm.
But clearly, the feedback you get from local organizations is actually, could you come and help us with this? So if you're being asked, then don't go into a kind of traumatized crouch and say, no, I couldn't possibly, as I just did, in fact. Actually, sort of think, well, how and when am I useful? And then I'll come in if asked. I will not try and build people's capacity unless they've actually asked me to.
Mm.
There's this terrible thing on capacity building. I once worked in DFID, the UK government ministry, which is now been abolished, and we got an application from an Indian NGO saying we would like to come and build the capacity of British NGOs because we don't think they know what they're talking about. And it was, to my last regret, that DFID refused to fund it. I thought it was a great idea.
That would have been
This
fabulous.
this was 20 years ago. It was brilliant. But it's that thing about we get asked to go in and facilitate much. So I think if you're an outsider, the skills of facilitation and convening conversations and respectfully chipping in experiences from elsewhere and then getting out. Yeah, leaving the room is really important. I looked at this. I was doing a study of an aid funded organization in Tanzania, and the person from the donor wanted to be in the room because she saw herself as on site. Like, she was married to an African. She didn't see any difference between her and the Tanzanian staff, but boy, the Tanzanian staff did.
Hmm.
So when she came into the room, the whole conversation died. They could see the power in the room. Everyone was really anxious and worried about offending the donor, saying the wrong thing. You've got to be aware of your positionality, as we say these days, and uh, and work, and incorporate that into the way you come across.
Hmm. Thank you. And then back to the first, in a more local context, to what extent can activism or these things be taught? And to what extent does it just have to develop naturally?
Oh, both. So obviously, if you go into a community, there will be people who for some reason have charisma, have power, either formal or informal. They might be the traditional leader or the former civil servant or the sort of the lay preacher, the mother of the local church or whatever it is that people look up to, and they will often be the leaders, right? I mean, that often works. Um, but you can also train people if I think you do it in that leadership style where you give people you focus on identifying people who could become leaders. They have the right level of sort of commitment, passion, and so on. And then there's a whole way of doing that brutal thing that I was talking about, where you set them some tasks, you support them in the task, you then evaluate whether they achieve the task, and then you push them harder. And I'm quite interested in this whole community organizing thing because it's very different from the more sort of. I worked at Oxfam for 20 years, and the Oxfam model is more about the win, is about changing policy, and this is a much more conscious way of bringing on leaders.
Hmm.
And some people find it very upsetting, because you're saying you can come to the meeting, but you've got to bring 20 people with you. And you're saying that to some 17-year-old,
Hmm.
and they feel completely stressed by it. If they manage it, they feel great and fired up and they're ready to go. If they don't achieve it, they feel terrible. So it's quite, big stuff which you're
Hmm.
doing with people.
And is that community organizing approach more about the process then, rather than the
Yeah.
end result? Really? Okay.
So the contrast is, I think, in the pure form, and there isn't a pure in practice, it's not this simple, but in the pure form, community organizing is not about the win.
Hmm.
It's about, okay, you do a campaign on something because people are angry about it. I went to a meeting last week about water, a meeting the week before about mold in housing. You get people fired up about that, but it's about building power.
Hmm.
And the win is like a way to build power. In a traditional advocacy organization, it's about changing the law, getting the spending commitment. In practice, they tend to get a bit blurred, but I think it's useful to see those two as distinct.
And is there a metric or a way that you would assess the kind of the end outcome? I know it's not about the win, but is there a way that you would tell, oh, this project is doing a good job, or this organization has really got it in this community organizing sphere? Is there a way of
Yeah, I'm not.
measuring that, or just no?
I'm not really a metrics guy. Um, there's plenty of qualitative ways to find out whether an organization is achieving change. It would be quite, just looking at who are the leaders and whether they've changed over the last 2 years would be a pretty effective way to test whether they're developing new generations of leaders. If it's still, as someone put it to me, the same 30-year-old guy with a can of lager speaking at the end of the meeting, then something's not working, right? That was from someone in the British environmental movement, describing what was wrong with the British environmental movement. Um, yeah, there are ways you can do that. And you develop those metrics with the people concerned.
Mhm.
How would we know if this is working? Right, let's try it.
Mm, mm. Really, really interesting. Um, we had a question on global collaboration towards policy reform, and the place of kind of networks across countries and reform-minded individuals across different contexts working together. And whether you think that policies created or thought up in that context can be well received in local or national environments. Because I do think there tends to be some fear, hesitation, uncertainty from national governments of these kind of networks of more reform-minded individuals. Um, so I guess it's more also a question about having a government receive policy that's been created in a context that is not entirely within that government's own kind of functioning.
Yeah, great questions. Lots of layers here. So one is, I think over the last 20 years, there's been a pushback against the idea that global campaigns are the main show, right? So I think, yeah, maybe that peaked with a thing called Make Poverty History in 2005, when I joined Oxfam in 2004, it was basically a circus. We just went from G7 to WTO to, whatever. We had this we had a good time. We thought we were really bringing about change. And then, the more I read, the more I talked to people, it was obvious that change is primarily national. And it's national politics, interaction between active citizens and effective states. And all the push from outside, including from activists, is second order. Now, that was like mid-noughties. I think it's got even more complex since then because a lot of governments got extremely annoyed with what they saw as foreign interference around the color revolutions of the late, when basically NGOs were part of a wider Western regime change project in a number of autocracies. So then suddenly, well, not suddenly, but over time, there's been an attempt to say any form of foreign funding is foreign interference in domestic politics, passing laws to say if you receive foreign funding, you have to describe yourself as a foreign agent in countries like India. There was even a case in America where the Center for Global Development was getting money from the Norwegian government to work on climate change, and various right wingers in the States accused Norway of trying to interfere in US politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's a pushback against these kind of global caravans and global activism. I think regional activism is really interesting because regional activism, the contexts are closer. They're not the same, but they're closer. It's much easier to get attention in India by saying Bangladesh is doing better, or to get attention in Bangladesh by saying India is doing better, although that doesn't often happen. Because people feel more connection and more rivalry with locals, with neighbours, and it's easier to do cross fertilization. There's more people have more in common. So Latin Americans speaking to Latin America, South Asians talking to South Asian, Pacific Islanders talking to Pacific Islanders. I think that makes more sense than these big global things, and that helps the cross fertilization. I think there's also something goes on there around increasingly since I've been working in development. It's not about the policy, it's about the norms. It's about deeper underlying ideas of what is normal or acceptable or unacceptable. I think norm shifts are easier to achieve locally than globally as well. So you won't get this big Western pushback against the Western women's rights agenda if it's coming from the next door country, So that kind of thing as well. I think increasing focus on norm shifts also lends itself to local conversations.
It's interesting you said norm shifts feel easier to push. Is that correct? And if so, just because it seems a little counterintuitive to me, it seems that the easier things to push often are the plain legislation or the quota
I'm
but
not
you don't
saying
think
they're
so.
easy, Nina. I'm not saying they're easy.
Okay.
I'm saying that I mean norms shifts take a generation.
Mm,
And it's and if you're a campaigner, you want to show your wins, and so
mm,
you want to get a little tweaked policy, great. But actually, you can pass all the gender rights legislation you want. If norms don't shift on gender rights, nothing much is going to change. So that's, I think, been a realization over the last 20 years. Is much more attention to these deeper underlying norms. Hellish to change, hard to measure, super important.
mm,
And so I think, no, all I was saying was it's probably easier to do that at a local or regional level. I mean, if you do global, it's much easier for those norms to then be denounced as, you know, you know, European views of homosexuality,
No.
feminism, or whatever. Nothing to do with us, you know. Whereas if you're in one East African country talking to another East African country saying, well, actually, we've got a long LGBTQ tradition. What are you talking about? Then it's easier to talk,
No.
have that conversation. Still not easy though.
No, it certainly isn't. That completely makes sense though. And I think I just misheard you on that one. So that sounds very good. That's the extent of the questions that I have, but I'm wondering if you have any questions for me or want to add anything. I mean, this has been really lovely and really productive, I think. So thank you so much for chatting with me.
Yeah. I think I have a meta thing,
Yeah.
a sort of a hypothesis, really.
Mm,
Our whole center at the LSE, the Activism, Influence and Change Center, is the premise is that if you intentionally design change strategies based on trying to swallow a horse, right? So you have these big, complex political, economic, social systems. You try and understand those, and we think that there's a way to bring that understanding into designing your change strategy intentionally. Our assertion is that that will lead to more effective activism than if you just act out of anger or passion or habit.
mm.
And that's the thing we've got to try and prove and see if we can convince people.
Very interesting. So really designing that advocacy and activism within the system that you are working in. Is that's what you're
Yeah.
saying?
We start with a systems map.
Mm.
Yeah, you're working on period products in Rwanda. You know, so all the players involved in the taxation of period products, right? You then say, well, the problem is girls in schools can't get access. You then do a stakeholder analysis of all the people who affect the policy on that. You then look at who agrees with you, who disagrees with you, how powerful they are, and you then start to think about alliances, and only then do you start thinking about designing a strategy to move people either up in more influence or more support, and start developing a coalition to bring about that change. And then you come up with some tactics right at the end, right? Whereas the alternative would be, we're really cross about the fact that girls can't get access to period products. Let's do a Twitter campaign or an Insta campaign or something like that. And we're saying, no, you've got to do more, you've got to work harder than
Mm. That completely makes sense to me. But yeah, I think the inability to work hard, I think, has definitely been an issue with a lot of policies and just ideas and just perceptions and ways of doing development. So yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that.